I'm going to get started then with the kind of the introduction cruft, and then we'll dive into the tech. Good afternoon. My name is Nick Popovich. And what I wanted to do to give you the opportunity to leave, if this is not your cup of tea, is just kind of sum up the talk from the get-go. So what this talk is going to be about is using, let me preface it. So I'm not going to go out of my way to, I've done some cursory obfuscation of the ISP's name, and I'm not going to go out of my way to say their name, but I'm sitting in a room full of very smart people. If you figure it out, that's fine. But I don't want to draw attention to the specific ISP's name because that's not the point of the talk. The point of the talk is about the process, the research, and the outcome. So that's kind of the little boilerplate I have up there. So the long and the short of this discussion is I use the ISP's own software to identify a flaw that allowed me to do a lot of things I shouldn't have been able to do. The first phase was associating the BSSIDs, or the wireless network names, with public IP addresses. And then as I dug in a little bit, I found that I could pull wireless encryption keys and some other data, and we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about the process of which I disclosed this finding with them, and it's kind of a win, because in the information security community, you tend to see a lot of horror stories when you're reading online of white hat researcher prosecuted and a lot of scary things. Now, let me preface this with saying I don't give it legal advice. None of this is legal advice, but it's my story and my situation, and I kind of want to use it as a win and encourage others to do some of the similar research. But it's not legal advice, and it's when responsible disclosure goes well, which is kind of neat and not something that sometimes the big media likes to. So this is a little about me. I'm a pen tester right now. I have a background in the military, working with the DoD financial sectors. I've done sysadmin and defending networks and also attacking networks. I've kind of gotten to do a lot of different things. I'm a father of 2 and a husband to 1. My wife was like, that makes no sense at all. Like, it's cool, I'm leaving it. I suffer from, my wife calls it the curious hermit syndrome. I don't turn it off. When I work, I think a lot of people in this room experience the same thing. You don't unplug, and everything, you want to put everything under the microscope. One of the reasons I give this talk too is to inspire those of us who, to give some of the products that we don't, during our 9 to 5 or whenever we're working, we have a certain role, and then to not turn it off and to put the products that we use in our home environments or whatnot that may not get as much scrutiny under the research microscope. You'd be surprised what you see. And I don't stop tinkering, and I'm also a veteran. So, thank you for thanking me for thanking you for thanking me. So, one of the points of this is small office, home gear. It has recently started to come into light with some folks reverse engineering some firmware. But for the most part, it's not given the granular inspection as much of the enterprise class gear gets, because the enterprise class gear has their own QA shops, and then pen testers or security assessments find flaws in that gear. So this is kind of an area that it slides under the radar to a degree. Like I said, I want to encourage the research. I'm nothing special. The front row especially will tell you I'm nothing special. But this is an opportunity to see, using some very simple tools and just being inquisitive, I found a lot of neat stuff. I just wanted an excuse to talk about what was cool tinkering, and then, again, go over my disclosure. So I'm going to briefly tell you a story about how this all happened. I moved, and I had to move my internet service. So the major ISP sent out a technician to my house after he moved the service, and I said, all right, thank you, hook up the stuff. And when he was done, he was like, here, I need you to plug this sketchy USB into your computer so I can get credit for the work. And I was like, I'm not exactly comfortable with that, but so he was like, look, I need to run some of these tools to test the line, and I don't get credit for this visit if I don't do this. And I was like, all right. So I pull up my Linux laptop, and he's like, oh, we don't support Mac. I was like, calm down, calm down. So I spin up a Windows VM, one of my throwaways, and he plugs his USB in, and all of a sudden a page launches, and all these green dials start going green and red, and I'm just like, whatever, man, it's fine. You do your thing. I'm going to get out of your way. And before he left, he said, I want to tell you about the the agent software that we have for your management of your environment. And so he says, you can do a lot of neat things with this. Let me show you. And he installs some product on my VM, goes about tinkering, and says, you can do some interesting things with this. You can get information about your wireless network. You can reset your router password. You can reset your network password. You can do a lot of things. It's really cut down on our support calls. We really suggest folks install this application. And I was like, I didn't really care. I said, that's fine. And so he left. And I'm tinkering about it. And later I need to go in and I need to reset the router password and set the security settings for wireless. And of course, I forgot what we had set it at. So I was like, interesting. It was still up, running on this VM. I hadn't turfed it yet. And I went in and I said, let's just reset the router password. And so I put in a new, and it didn't prompt me for the original one. I said, curious. And I set the password, and I could log into my router. I was like, well, maybe it was an orphaned session, or something has persisted from what he was doing earlier. Can't be that simple. So I turfed the VM, spun up another one, download the software, install it, say, change my password. And without prompting me for a new one, it allowed me to change the router password. I was like, this is peculiar. And I wanted to understand what was going on deeper, so I started to dig in, because I wanted to understand how this binary was working and communicating with my router. So I spun up Wireshark, and it was confusing to me. It actually raised more questions. I saw some gets. I saw some stuff in responses that was confusing to me, where it was simulating mouse clicks. And there was just some stuff that wasn't making sense to me, so I said, let's take this a different place. I'm also seeing these posts, and there's password values pre-populated, and I just didn't understand. Just by watching The Wire, I needed to go deeper. But one of the things I noticed as I was watching Wireshark, there was a lot of encrypted traffic with an internet IP address, and I expected this traffic to be primarily on my LAN. I didn't think it needed to call out. And so I was like, this is peculiar. And one of the things I noticed was the name of this major ISP in the certificate info for the TLS connections. I was like, peculiar. Let's go deeper. So what I did was I proxified. This was an application that wasn't meant to natively accept a proxy. So I went in and got some neat Windows apps that lets you, it's kind of like proxy chains on Linux. It lets you force non-proxy aware applications over a proxy. So I just proxified all connections. I was using burp, and to allow it to continue, what I had to do is I installed the burp CA, or you could create your own. As long as your browser trusts the CA so it doesn't interrupt the SSL connection, it works. Configure burp to use it. I configured burp to generate a self-signed SSL, a self-signed cert for the name of the site that I saw in the certificate. And then it was important to allow to configure burp to use invisible proxying. Just because this was new to me and some folks aren't very familiar with invisible proxying, what it is non-proxy aware applications don't submit requests in a way that something that would be able to use a proxy would. So it doesn't use the name of the host that you're trying to get. It uses the host header. So a non-proxy aware request looks like the second one, where it's getting a page and it uses the host header to say which host it's going to. A proxy aware request will put the name of the host you're going to in the actual get or in the request itself. So that was a big key with this. When you're proxying, especially from a VM or anything, if you're forcing something over a proxy that doesn't expect to be, you need to enable invisible proxying, or else it doesn't work well. So as I'm watching some of this traffic via burp, now I can see everything because I can see into the SSL, and I start seeing some interesting requests. So the first request I see is this strange string. And I noticed that this is there were SOAP verbs occurring. So this was a SOAP service over the internet. And just there's nothing really interesting on here except this good-looking string. Just kind of keep that in your mind as we progress. So another request that's initiated, and also let me preface that the traffic you're watching right now is just it starting up. I spun the app up and I'm watching what happens. I haven't started to manipulate the app at all. This is just spin-up traffic. So I'm seeing these keywords go, and I see this GUI session ID, and it looks, if you look at the GUI session ID, it looks very similar to what was there before, but in the midst of it is a public IP address. Interesting. So I took note of the keyword values. I took note of this GUI session ID, which seemed to persist on the requests. And I start to get a little torqued as what I'm starting to see. These are requests coming from my machine. Also take note of this keyword value, line record CV1. We'll talk about that a little bit. But we see my PC Mac being sent. We see my host name. We see my Windows username. And so this was the request. My privacy hackles are going up a tad. Because I'm like, why do you need my MAC address? But who cares? But why do you need my MAC address? Why do you need my Windows username? If this was my corporate laptop, here I'm sending a major ISP data that, why am I sending this data? Now the response piqued my interest quite a bit. And notice the keyword, this server text reference seemed to be a call and response. So you have a keyword that you request, this SOAP service, and then this text reference was kind of the response to that. So I kind of figured that earlier we saw, this is line record CV1, and then we see cached LR. I'm like, CV1 must be like cached value 1 or something like that, because I'm seeing a cached line record here. I started to put that together just in my head. But the response contained things that really bothered me, namely my zip code, my state, my phone number, my username for, no, I didn't use the ISP's email, but that had my username there. So again, I have not started to interrogate this application at all. This is me watching the traffic as it's starting up. So we see the GUI session ID again, and it seems to continue to persist. It just has these random series of numbers that appears, and then what I end up deducing is my WAN IP address in this GUI session ID. So we see this keyword is sent, this PCIHA Wi-Fi info keyword. What it returns is my wireless network name and my wireless network key and my encryption type. And I'm like, good night, Moon, that's not cool. And it was coming from, all this traffic is coming from the internet. I'm like, I would be okay with this to a degree if it's coming from my personal router. But now I'm full on super curious. And then another thing that just started getting me, something that I took note of, was just all this data that started sending up. My operating system type, my security type for my wireless network name, security type. It had a hard coded, that key ended up being what was printed on the tag on the router that you get from these folks. But all this, and then it sent my legit wireless key. It sent what this is not clear text, so that's a good point. The data, this is all SSL, thankfully. But it's still data that's being sent from me to them, and I'm not enjoying it. Just a couple of other things. My disks, disk sizes that are free, all this data. And I guess, in one stance, some folks are like, the more data, the better. But I just still don't understand what's going on. So I said, let's check this out. Maybe when the tech was here, a tech ID, or because it's a new install, this is all new. So I shut the app off, turned it back on, watched it again. Same thing happened. I was like, let's do the changing of the password. Now, I'm changing the password on my router. This should never, why would it need to talk to the internet? I don't see why it should. So I changed the password on my router. And all of a sudden, after I change my password, it reinitiates a post and sends the newly changed password to the internet. And I call this my selfish phase. At this point, I really just worried about me and my data. I'm like, I don't like the fact that my ISP is collecting this data, and I still wanted to understand why it's going to the internet. That's my biggest problem. If it was all local communication with my router locally, it would be different. And one of the other things that I noticed was after I would initiate this communication with the application would communicate over the internet, a lot of posts and GETs would start shooting over to my router. But I didn't quite understand that yet. So these are the questions that I'm curious about, but I'm only focusing on myself and my data. Now, I started wondering, what's used for authentication? Because I didn't see much for authentication. I was like, it has to be some, maybe just basic cookies. But it can't be cookies, because I remember as I was testing, I saved some of these requests, and I started sending them with no cookies. And we're still getting the same data. And so I'm like, there has to be some secret sauce within this whole process. There's authentication occurring. There's got to, maybe it's at a layer I can't see. Maybe it's a network layer. So I try this from another ISP. Like I went to my father-in-law's house. He's got a whole different provider, and I tried this process, and I'm getting the same data about myself, because I was saving these burp requests. They're saved that I had run on my network, so I'm being careful, because I really did not want to tread. I thought this may be a scenario where, this was during when we was going through all the sentencing and stuff like that. I'm like, you know, I'm a father, I've got kids. I love doing what I do, but I'm not going to jail because I'm curious. So I was focusing on myself and my data. But I did wonder, I was like, I wonder if I can get anybody else's stuff. But I wasn't really going to try it, because that was just some sort of rabbit hole I didn't feel like going down at the time. So I wanted more info, though. So what I did is, instead of just passively watching it work, I started playing with all the different knobs and switches on the application. And one of the funny things, so every option that was there, I started clicking through it. Every place I could put input, I just started watching the data as it went by. I started running, and again, I was never running any like attacks, like using a burp scan against this site. I was just watching the traffic, never trying to fuzz or manipulate the inputs. I was just putting in data, like 1, 2, 3, and whatnot. So I was playing around, just learning how the software works, watching it. So I was watching it with Process Hacker and just various Windows tools to see what it did, watch how it touched the file system, what registry keys, used burp just to continue to watch all the traffic that it generated over the internet. I started to make a list of all these keywords, and I started to kind of understand how, at least I thought I could understand how this SOAP service on the internet was working based on these keywords and responses and requests and whatnot. So I just kind of started to map the business logic, or how I thought the business logic of the application worked. And while I was going through, it was kind of interesting. I ended up finding that they used AutoIt to write this application. So, and it was a discovery that was by accident, because I like AutoIt. It does some funny things, and it's a neat little wrapper for Windows coding. It is fun. And so I had it installed on this VM that I was using for research. And as I was inspecting the file system, I noticed just that the default AutoIt binary logo, when you compile an AutoIt, it has the default logo there, and it was there. And I was like, oh. So I put reversed in quotes, because it's not real reverse engineering. The reverse engineers here would throw things at me if I said I reverse engineered an AutoIt binary, because it's not exactly legitimately compiled. And there are applications that you can use to get the source code of AutoIt scripts from an executable. So I did. And I started looking at the source of the binary that kind of runs the show for this whole application. And one of the things I noticed was this gen_GUID function down there. And remember I said earlier, I said it looked like a random string of numbers and then my IP address. Well, it's a random string of numbers, and your WAN IP address is this GUID. It's from their binary. Now, I don't remember. Let's go back. You want to keep reading the code? You can read the code. So, the accident. Remember when I said this was my selfish phase, and I was focused on my data and my own? I was curious about others' data, but I was like, I'm not gonna go beyond maybe. I started thinking, well, maybe I'll test family and friends who are using the same ISP, and we'll see if I can. But I just really was being kind of trepidatious with the whole process. Well, it was near Christmas time, so I went on vacation, and I rested and relaxed, and it was great. So after Christmas, I spin up my saved burp states, and I start submitting the same requests again to get data back. And so as I'm looking, I see things, and my WAN IP is right, the keywords are right. You notice I removed the CV1, because what I found out was if you removed anything with CV that was cached value, so you could get live, like you could query the data from the database rather than maybe a cached database. Anyways, manipulating some of the keywords and removing values ended up giving me fresh data. And so here we're sending the same line record, the same GUI session ID from back in the day, same WAN IP address, but I pulled new data. And I also noticed the response is new content. and it's some other dude's zip code, some other dude's username, and some other dude's city. Nearby city, but it's some other dude's stuff. I'm like, what just happened here? This is not good stuff. Also, as I'm watching, because the process is going, I started the application. It's just running now. Sends this keyword with the GUI session ID from before, and I get his web key. And I'm like, well, you know what? That could be just the default value. This is probably not live data. This is, this is a fluke, and what's the situation? So let me tell you what had happened. I discovered my WAN IP changed over Christmas. Like we lost power or whatever the case may be. So here I'm sending this data, and I'd had a theory. I was like, that GUI session ID is all over the place. That has to be something important. Well, what I accidentally tested after coming back from break was the GUI session ID was kind of used as your identifier of who you are and a surrogate to some sort of form of authentication. But the GUI session ID just had to look like the format that it was generated in. So if it looked just like that, and you jam in a WAN IP address in the middle of it, you are now querying data as that user from over the internet. And so it's like, yeah, it was an accident. Total accident. So I'm kind of worried too. I'm like, do I call the ISP and do I bring this up? Do I just turf all my research and put my head under a pillow and hope it goes away? Will they care? Will they care in a good way? Will they care in a bad way? What if they don't fix it? That was the question that I asked that bothered me. What if they don't fix it? I almost felt like a social responsibility because I'm like, here's the situation. A selfish phase, I'm like, that's my data up there. I am not the sharpest tool in the tool shed. People may have already discovered this, or people will eventually, and all of a sudden they're pulling data out there, and I was like, I started to hype myself up. I was talking to my wife. I was like, I'm a customer. I have a little bit more right to go in and be like, I found this, but not adversarially. Just go in and say, this is something that we should address. But I was also scared because, Weave's going to jail for pulling email addresses. So it's such a gray area. I sat on it for a while, and I decided the best approach would be to not be adversarial, to be as a concerned customer, and to ensure that I carried myself with, decorum and professionalism, and went as an emissary and not an adversary. So my process in this, it was difficult to find a point of contact that made sense or that could understand what I was saying, because I didn't really have many points of contact, and I didn't want to, just go out and be like, hey, who do I talk to? So I actually called first line support, like who you'd call if your internet went down. And I was like, I need to talk to someone about this issue, and they didn't understand. They put me to their manager. They didn't understand, and I actually have chat logs. I was trying to have due diligence and make sure that I'm doing this appropriately and document records, because at first I was calling. I was like, wait, there's no records of these calls. Let's use the chat system. Chat system was a terrible idea because they had no idea. They had less idea. And so I'm going through, and it was months of me, and I was also not aggressively trying to, because I was still nervous. I was like, I want to talk about this, but I don't want to be adversarial. When I did find a point of contact, a friend of mine on IRC was like, here's the deal. I have a guy who might be able to be the appropriate channel for this thing. So one of the big takeaways from this, for organizations especially, is make it obvious on where folks can reach out to talk to you. I mean, I even tried to send to like abuse@thename.com and send emails to folks because I was like, it's not, this is a different concept of bug bounties. I'm not trying to say companies need to have a bug bounty avenue and folks, because there's a whole big discussion on does that encourage or discourage type. But if a legitimate customer has a problem, they need to be able to contact somebody and then have a process and channels. So the cool thing is after this, they actually enacted some new processes that made it easier. But this is funny. I found this person, I was given this person's email address. I emailed them pretty late at night, expecting to talk to them in a couple of days. And I got a response in 7 minutes. I emailed them, and they said, this is an issue. Can you be on a call tomorrow? I said, cool. So I I amped myself up for for what would come up, and I said, all right, I'm going to go in, and I'm just going to focus on, I'm a concerned customer. I'm not doing malicious things. I want to come at you as an advocate, not an adversary. And in this case, they were super appreciative. And I got on a conference call with like 9 people. And the crazy thing was they didn't make me sign a bunch of NDAs. They were really focused on, thank you for identifying this. Now let's fix it. And so they came at me with, there was security team, there was incident response team, there were lawyers, there were developers, there were managers, everybody in the world, but they weren't accusing me. And I think one of the takeaways from that is I came at them with a lot of humility, and I was just as a concern, and I kept reiterating that I didn't want this to be a case where they think that anybody was hacking them or anything like that. This was just me, and I kept using terms like passive. I was passively watching traffic. I was passively doing these things. They actually fixed the issue in a couple of days. They asked me to test it. They called me up and so we put in some mitigations and we fixed it. It was funny too because it also demonstrated how in IT and sometimes there's a divide between the information security department and maybe developers or frontline support because you had the security team on and they were like, well, is there anything else? After we were talking about it. I was like, well, you guys use Autoit for the binary that's not exactly enterprise class. And the security guy's like, what? You used Autoit? And then I was like, yeah, there's some log files that are stored locally on the machine that contain data that's probably not good. And so all of a sudden, I'm like a kid at the dinner table watching their dads fight, kind of quiet. It's like watching dad and mom fight because you're quietly sitting there while the security team's like, what are you talking? And we didn't get to assess this. And it was very interesting. But then they came together, and it was neat to watch this process as they started to gel and then get on the same page. And they started, well, we're going to change some processes, and there's going to be reviews, and it was pretty neat. And later on, they actually gave me, they called a couple weeks later. I never expected to hear from them. They fixed it. And the fix was basically, and I did not go beyond what they asked me to do because I'm staying within the parameters and the scope of what they said. They said, all I did was some burp requests that I had saved and then ran the app a couple times. And then it started to do 301s and got a 500 one time. But it didn't work the way I had originally showed them that it worked, and that is all I was going to do. Because I'm still a little trigger shy at this point. So they called me a couple weeks later and they say, we really appreciate that. We're obviously a big target for folks because we're a major ISP, and this was really cool. And they gave me a discount on my service. They gave me free service for like a year, and then a discounted service, and they gave me kudos, which is awesome. So, summary of the research. Oh, this is coming up on some of the things that folks had asked questions about before that I wanted to make sure I touched. So those affected, this is not every customer of this ISP. It was only those customers who, A, ran the gear that they give you when they, their router, and also subsequently ran this agent software that communicated. I actually ended up finding somebody who had their own gear, a business, who had their own gear, like they had an ASA. Oh, thanks. Come back. Thank you. And I checked, with their permission, I used their WAN IP address, put it in the GUI session ID, started using their information, and was pulling back nothing. I mean, it was pulling back line record data, but nothing. So it seemed like the it factor was you had to use ISP gear, and you had to use their software. Folks were curious about what the fix was last time I spoke about this. Like I said, I didn't go deep dive, because I was done with my accidental discoveries for the lifetime. But like I said, they enacted something that didn't allow you just to use the GUI session ID as a random, they didn't just let you use a WAN IP address and the GUI session ID as the authenticating factor that lets you pull data on that customer using their WAN IP address. And it was an interesting, well, yeah, that was it. So I could only confirm that I could no longer pull others' info without authentication. one of the things is when I used the new version of their software, the data was still being pushed, pulled, and sent. And they told me that was a feature that they want support to be, yeah, big quotes on that. It's a feature. That it cuts down on support calls. And I said, you know, here's a problem with that just in general. I was like, if I'm on the same network as this gear, I can reset the router's password. Because there was still no authentication occurring. You know, once this process happened, you could still just reset the router's password, and the only thing you need to do is be on the same network. I'm like, well, if you're on the network, you're trusted. I was like, that's not the way that you view it. They said, well, we're going to be coming up with some changes. But the point I was trying to make was, just because somebody's trusted on the same subnet doesn't mean they're trusted. You know, if somebody comes to my house, I don't want them resetting my router's password and changing the DNS settings and all that silly stuff. And they're like, good call. We'll take that under review. So if you still use the latest version of their product or earlier ones, the data is still sent. And it's basically how the software works. So my privacy hackles, I still said I'd really, appreciate this, and they were like, well, you don't have to do this. I was like, yeah, but your technicians really want it to be done, and average Joe Schmo user are going to let it happen. I'm just barely above an average Joe Schmo user, and I let it happen because the guy was like, oh, come on, I don't get credit for this install if I don't run this. I was like, you kind of are having a systemic flaw that is, this data is getting scooped up. So yeah, the fix, I can't confirm nor deny, but I can say that what I just told you doesn't work anymore. So what are some of the takeaways of this? Well, first of all, disclosure can go right, and you've got to weigh it and discuss it and talk about it. Maybe I can't say every situation is going to be roses. I can say that this situation for me and the way I approached it worked well and had a decent outcome. Also, this is a good example of implicit trust in the various applications we have running in our environments is not exactly a good thing. And what's the old saying that the cobbler's kids have no shoes? Sometimes folks in InfoSec, we work, or in IT at all, or whatever industry you're in, we tend to work in our jobs, and then our environments don't get as much speculation, granular. We don't look at our environments as closely as we may our corporate environments or environments we're assessing and whatnot. So it's funny, a lot of folks here have probably just, man in the middle of your phone and watch it over burp and just watch all the madness and stuff that's happening. If you just run Wireshark, say you have a gateway device, or you just run Wireshark on your environment, just from your PC, your home computer, whatever you run, watch the wire, you might just start to see a lot of data that you're curious. Why are these connections happening? That's how this started. And I want to encourage that. I want people to go home today, turn on their computers, and start categorizing and putting a list and saying, what are these connections and what are they for? Because your mind will be blown. And then one of the other things is it's kind of still on our shoulders as a community of technologists, security professionals, and folks that care about this kind of stuff to bring this to light. Because obviously in this case, this was a flaw that they hadn't heard about or hadn't been told about. And it's kind of like quasi our responsibility sometimes to take the effort to put in the research. And in this case, I got some free service, which was cool. But I didn't expect anything. And everything I did was using free tools. I used just the intercepting proxy feature on Burp. I was using Wireshark, and I was using Process Hacker. Most of these tools are free, and they're really well documented. Everybody here can do this type of research. I kind of said it in the beginning, but this is the warning. Don't go out and be like, well, Nick said it was cool to do all this stuff, so I'm going to go do it and talk to him. Yeah. The disclosure went well in this case. They were super appreciative. I can't say that'll happen every time. Could have taken a turn for the worse easily. I feel like it's a sad state of affairs, but most cyber laws are up for such prosecutorial discretion that it's the mood of the prosecutor that day. Do they want to make a name for themselves? Do they want to, how do they want to apply various laws that deal with computers and cybersecurity? So if you come at them hard and like, Haxor your system, and I got all these things, pay me, or you come at them combative and adversarially, I tend to think that the outcome may have not been so amenable for me. But I came at them with a lot of just trying to, good vibes, good vibes, good vibes, don't sue me, don't arrest me, don't do things. And it worked. I spread the IT love. Also, let's just use discretion and common sense. You know, when you're looking at tools and you're doing things, don't do things you know are wrong. That's what my mom used to say. Don't do things you know are wrong. Didn't work. Think of the consequences. Your mom must have said that too. So another aspect, I had a lot of guidance. In this community, we have a lot, we have IRCs, we have mailing lists, we have conferences where we can get together. And that's one of the things why conferences are so valuable, because you can get together with peers and discuss things. And I got a lot of advice on how I should carry myself. Got a lot of advice. I got the point of contact from a peer. And I got the opportunity to bounce off ideas and say, how should I proceed? And if it weren't for the peers and my colleagues helping me with some guidance, I think it could have gone differently as well. And then, kind of to go back to my point of, as a community, InfoSec has the responsibility, because sometimes we have the tools, we have the mindsets, and we have the passion. Because I love this stuff. I do it day in, day out. I don't turn it off. My hobbies are involved. All of this is what I love to do. When in doubt, you can do the disclosure anonymously so that it gets fixed. Yeah, you're not going to get accolades. You may not get your name on a CVE. You're definitely not going to get free cool service. But at least the flaw is fixed. And that was my biggest concern, mainly because I was selfish. And I was like, my data's in there. I don't want some dude grabbing my stuffs. Because I at first considered disclosing when I just was like, I can map public IP addresses to wireless network names. I was like, that's kind of a decent data to get. And then when I started seeing encryption keys that worked, oh, let me go back. I'm sorry, I missed a part of my story. So before I did the accidental disclosure, or no, right after I did the accidental disclosure, I went to a couple friends and I said, hey, here's the research, here's what I'm doing. Let me just check if this is legit, because I see my data and it's legit. I don't know if your stuff is real or not. I can't test. So I went to a friend. I was like, what's your WAN IP? He was like, what's a WAN IP? I was like, go to getmyip.com. Read me the number there. And he said, here it is. And I said, cool. So I did the request, and I pulled his data, and I was like, is this your WEP key? He was like, what's a WEP key? I was like, it's probably written on your fridge. Go. It's the thing you type in to connect to your computer. He was like, oh, yeah, let me go. And he goes back and ruffles, and he's like, yeah, that's my WEP key. So I was like, all right. So I found somebody that was not using WEP. And I said, let's do this. Let's pull your data. And I pulled the data. Now, a caveat to this research, in the middle of it, I stopped being able to retrieve the WPA keys for folks using WPA and WPA2. And I don't believe it's because the data wasn't there anymore. It's because the keyword values changed, because I started getting errors when I was pulling that data, when I was testing it then. And I was only testing on folks that I went and got their permission, individual customers that were also friends of mine. But originally, I was able to pull that data, and I verified it that it was the real data that they used for their network, so it was live. But to go back to my point, when in doubt, disclose anonymously, because the key is getting it fixed. Yeah, I agree with the no more free bugs. I agree with the people should be paid for their work. And I'm not getting into kind of a bug bounty discussion. I care about the security posture of the Internet of Things. I just care that the bug gets fixed, especially if my data's in there. So I'm going to wrap it up now, a little bit early. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask away. If not, then I escaped the sign a little early.